Alright, let's get into it. We're about to dig into something that's going to blow your mind, the idea that the very first Bible, yes, the one that predates the version sitting on most bookshelves today, actually reveals that God might not be who we think he is. We're talking about a God who isn't the all-loving, all-knowing deity we've been taught to revere, but instead, the devil himself. Sounds crazy, right? Well, hold on. In 1945, a group of farmers stumbled upon something buried in the sands of Egypt. What they found was not your regular Bible. These were the Nag Hammadi texts, ancient writings that completely challenge what we've been told for millennia. These texts, alongside the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered just a few years later, contained alternative gospels and lost writings that the early church didn't want you to see. And here's the kicker, these writings, some of them older than the gospels we know today, tell a very different story about the creation of the world and the being we call God. The early church decided what went into the Bible that most of us know, the King James Version, the New International Version, whatever version you have, was carefully curated. They had the power to control the narrative. The Gnostic texts, they were thrown out. Not because they were false, but because they were dangerous to the church's teachings. Too controversial. Too radical. And what's in them would shake the very foundation of mainstream religion. The Gnostic writings introduce us to a concept called the Demiurge. This being, the creator of the material world, is a false god. You know all those stories in the Old Testament where God is jealous, angry, and destructive? That's not the God of ultimate love and light, it's the Demiurge. He's not the source of creation out of love, but a being that crafted the world to trap souls, to keep us in the dark. In other words, the God of the Bible isn't who we think he is. Think about the way the world is portrayed in Genesis. The earth is created, humans are placed in it, and then immediately, rules are set. Don't eat from this tree, don't gain knowledge. The one time humanity tries to learn, tries to break free, what happens? They're punished. Adam and Eve are thrown out of paradise for daring to seek wisdom. Why would a benevolent, loving God punish knowledge? What if the true crime wasn't disobedience, but liberation? The Gnostic texts argue that the God of the Old Testament, this Demiurge, isn't interested in your freedom or your enlightenment. His goal is to keep you under his control, enslaved in the material world, unaware of your true potential. And guess what? The early Christians knew this. Some of them, anyway. There were entire movements, like the Valentinians, who believed that the God most people worship isn't the real deal. They taught that the true divine force is beyond this world, and the Demiurge is just a cosmic mistake. A jailer. But these ideas were stamped out. The Roman Empire, when it adopted Christianity, needed a version of the faith that reinforced power structures, not one that questioned them. So the Gnostics were labeled heretics. Their texts were destroyed or hidden away. And for nearly 2,000 years, we've been told one side of the story. But now, thanks to these ancient discoveries, the other side of the story is finally being revealed. So, we're left with a burning question. If the Bible we've been taught was selectively curated, what does that say about the image of God that most people have? Could it be that the loving Creator in the New Testament and the wrathful, punishing God of the Old Testament are not the same being? Here's where the Nag Hammadi texts change everything. They tell us that this world, the one filled with suffering, injustice, and evil, wasn't created by a God of love, but by this lesser, twisted entity who thinks he's God. And the early Christians who followed these teachings believed that humanity's mission wasn't to obey blindly, but to break free. This is where the real story begins. The Nag Hammadi texts, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and many other ancient scriptures offer clues that point to an uncomfortable truth. The God of the Old Testament might just be the devil in disguise. According to the Gnostics, the God most people worship isn't the supreme creator. Nope. They believed in something way more radical, the idea that this world, this entire universe, was created by a false god, a being they called the Demiurge. And trust me, the Demiurge is not who you think he is. The Demiurge is portrayed as this ignorant, arrogant figure. He thinks he's the ultimate god, but in reality, he's just a blind creator, completely unaware of the higher, true divine force beyond him. In Gnostic texts, the Demiurge creates the material world, not out of love or grace, but as a cage. This world? It's a trap. And you and I? We're stuck in it. The material world is full of suffering, corruption, and pain. If you look closely, it almost feels like it was designed that way. Now, according to Gnosticism, this isn't by accident. The Demiurge wanted to keep us in ignorance, enslaved by the physical world, constantly distracted by the chaos of everyday life, unable to realize our true potential. The world was built to deceive us, to make us think that this is all there is. And the Demiurge is sitting at the top of this false reality, enjoying his illusion of power. And here's the wild part, the Gnostics didn't just see the Demiurge as a problem, they believed that we have something inside of us that the Demiurge fears, a spark of the true divine. Buried deep within us is this fragment of higher consciousness, a piece of the divine realm that the Demiurge can't touch. That's why he wants to keep us ignorant, why the whole system of this world is designed to distract and control. He knows that if we wake up to the truth, his grip over us weakens. Now, why would anyone worship a being like this? Because the Demiurge is a master manipulator. He's not just a creator, he's a tyrant. He wants worship, obedience, and fear. He keeps people in line by presenting himself as the ultimate authority, demanding blind faith and submission. And, for the most part, it's worked. Most of the world's religious systems, especially the traditional teachings of the Old Testament, reinforce this idea that we're supposed to fear God, submit to his will, and never question his authority. The Gnostics didn't see the Demiurge as the only power in the universe. Far from it. Above the Demiurge is the true source of all creation, often referred to as the One or the True God. This being is pure consciousness, pure light, completely removed from the chaos and corruption of the material world. But the Demiurge? He's completely ignorant of this higher reality. He thinks he's the only God because he's blind to anything greater than himself. He's literally trapped in his own illusion of power. And it doesn't stop there. The Gnostics also introduced a figure called Sophia, a divine being who plays a key role in this cosmic drama. According to their teachings, Sophia tried to create without the consent of the true God, and the result of her mistake was the Demiurge. Sophia realizes her error and becomes deeply involved in helping humanity wake up from the Demiurge's control. She represents wisdom, enlightenment, and the true path to spiritual liberation. So what does this mean for us? The Gnostics believed that awakening, or gnosis, was the key. Gnosis is the knowledge of this hidden truth, the realization that the material world is a deception and that we're capable of escaping it. But the Demiurge doesn't want us to find this knowledge. He wants to keep us locked in a cycle of ignorance, constantly distracted by material desires, societal expectations, and fear of punishment. Here's where it all starts to connect. In Gnostic thinking, the serpent in the Garden of Eden wasn't the villain of the story. Instead, the serpent represents a force of liberation. It offered humanity knowledge, the very thing the Demiurge didn't want us to have. The Gnostics flipped the entire story of Genesis on its head. In their eyes, the God who told Adam and Eve not to eat from the tree of knowledge wasn't protecting them, he was keeping them ignorant. And the serpent? The serpent was the one trying to wake them up. I know, it's wild, but it makes you rethink everything you've been told. If the Demiurge is this tyrannical being, keeping humanity in chains, then the whole concept of salvation changes. Salvation isn't about obedience to a higher power, it's about liberation from a false one. The real goal is to break free from the Demiurge's influence, to realize that the material world is a distraction, and to reconnect with the true divine force that exists beyond it. Now, here's where things really start to hit home. We've all asked this question at some point: if God is all-powerful and all-loving, why is there so much evil and suffering in the world? Why is life filled with pain, disease, natural disasters, and all the stuff that makes us question everything? Well, the Gnostics had a radically different answer to that question. They didn't believe that this world's suffering was just some mystery we can't understand or that it was part of some divine plan. No. They believed suffering was here because the God who created this world was not good. This wasn't a case of God allowing evil to happen, it was about the world being built on a flawed foundation by a flawed being. The Gnostics saw the creator of this world, the Demiurge, as incompetent or even malevolent. And when you look at the world through that lens, things start to make a strange kind of sense. Think about the big events we know from the Bible, especially the Old Testament. We've got the flood, where God wipes out nearly all of humanity. There's Sodom and Gomorrah, destroyed by fire. The plagues of Egypt, which included everything from locusts to the death of the firstborns. And these aren't acts of a benevolent, loving God, they're acts of vengeance and destruction. It's almost like the Bible itself is trying to tell us something. Maybe we've just been interpreting it wrong. The Gnostics would look at those stories and say, of course the world is messed up. It was designed that way. The Demiurge, in their view, wasn't interested in creating a perfect paradise. He created a world of suffering, pain, and control. His goal was to keep humanity trapped in this flawed existence, so we'd never reach beyond it to discover the truth. This world isn't a test of our faith, it's a prison. And evil? It's not some mystery we have to blindly accept. It's baked into the system. Now, that flips the whole concept of good and evil on its head, doesn't it? We're taught that evil exists because of human free will, because of temptation, or because we're somehow being tested. But the Gnostics saw it differently. They believed the material world itself was corrupted from the start, not because we failed, but because the being who made it was corrupted. So when people ask, why does God allow suffering? The Gnostic answer is pretty simple, because the God who rules over this world thrives on it. The Demiurge doesn't care about human suffering. In fact, it's part of his system of control. He keeps us down, keeps us fearful, keeps us worshipping him, while the true divine reality, the higher, pure consciousness beyond all of this, remains hidden from us. What's even more unsettling is how this idea of suffering as control plays out in everyday life. Think about it, how many of our major systems are built around control? Governments, religions, even social norms, they all have a way of keeping us in line, telling us what's right, what's wrong, and why we should be afraid if we step out of line. The Gnostics would argue that this is exactly what the Demiurge wants. A world built on fear and suffering makes for obedient followers. And then there's the idea of punishment. The Bible is full of examples where God punishes people for disobedience. But the Gnostics would say that these punishments aren't about justice or morality. They're about keeping people in their place, making sure they don't question the system. The story of Job is a perfect example. Here's a guy who does everything right, follows all the rules, and yet he suffers horribly, losing everything. Why? Because the Demiurge, the god of this world, doesn't care about fairness. He's all about control. Now, this is where we hit the deeper philosophical layer. If the creator of this world is flawed, then the suffering we experience isn't some cosmic lesson in morality. It's not about teaching us to be better or more faithful. It's about keeping us distracted, lost in pain, and too broken to see the bigger picture. This turns the entire concept of faith upside down. Instead of accepting suffering as part of God's plan, the Gnostics believed in rejecting the system altogether. They weren't looking for salvation through obedience or punishment. They were looking for liberation. If we're questioning the nature of God in these ancient texts, then we have to talk about one of the most misunderstood figures in all of religious history, Satan. Now, before you jump to conclusions, hear me out. What if Satan isn't the ultimate evil we've been told he is? What if he's actually the hero of the story? I know, it sounds wild, but this idea is way older than you think. In the Gnostic tradition, Satan, or more specifically Lucifer, is viewed very differently. You see, Lucifer isn't this evil being trying to corrupt humanity for fun. Instead, he's seen as the one who offers knowledge, enlightenment, and freedom. And, in some interpretations, that makes him the true liberator of humanity. Let's go back to the Garden of Eden. We all know the story. Adam and Eve are living in paradise, everything is perfect, and they've got just one rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Then along comes the serpent, who tempts Eve to eat the fruit. Eve does, Adam follows, and boom, they're banished from Eden. But here's the thing, what was the serpent really offering? Knowledge. Awareness. The ability to see the world for what it truly is. Think about it, the serpent didn't trick Eve into something meaningless. He gave her, and by extension, all of us, the chance to wake up, to see beyond the limits of the garden, to understand the difference between good and evil. That's not some villainous move. That's the kind of gift that opens up a whole new level of consciousness. And if the God of the Old Testament didn't want Adam and Eve to have that knowledge, what does that say about him? This is where the Gnostics come in again. They believed that the serpent in the garden wasn't Satan in the way we usually think of him. Instead, he was a symbol of rebellion against the Demiurge's control. By offering knowledge, the serpent was giving humanity the key to escape ignorance, the very thing the Demiurge wanted to maintain. In other words, Lucifer wasn't the enemy of humanity, he was our ally, the one who dared to stand up to the false god and offer us the truth. This flips the entire narrative. Lucifer, instead of being the ultimate figure of evil, becomes a symbol of light, literally. The name Lucifer comes from the Latin lux vere, which means the light bringer. He's the one who brings enlightenment, the one who challenges authority, and the one who says, you don't have to live in ignorance. You don't have to accept the world as it is. Now, it's important to recognize just how radical this idea was, and still is. If you're used to thinking of God as the ultimate authority and Satan as the ultimate rebel, this might feel like a complete reversal of everything you've been taught. But that's exactly why the early church worked so hard to suppress these Gnostic ideas. A story where the rebel is the hero and the creator is the villain? That's a dangerous narrative for any institution that's built on obedience and control. But let's take it a step further. In some Gnostic writings, Lucifer isn't just a symbol of rebellion, he represents a deeper truth about the nature of power and freedom. The Demiurge wants submission, he wants followers who don't question, who don't seek knowledge, who obey without understanding. Lucifer, on the other hand, represents the idea that true power comes from questioning authority, from seeking knowledge, and from breaking free of imposed limits. This is a theme that runs through a lot of mythology and literature, not just in Gnostic writings. Look at stories like Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humanity. He's punished for his defiance, just like Lucifer, but he's celebrated as a hero because he dared to challenge the gods and give humanity something valuable. The fire Prometheus gives is knowledge, just like the fruit Lucifer offers in Eden. It's the same archetype, the rebel who risks everything to bring enlightenment to humanity. What if rebellion against authority isn't inherently evil? What if it's actually the path to freedom? If the Demiurge is a false god who thrives on control, then rebelling against him isn't just an act of defiance, it's an act of liberation. And Lucifer, as the symbol of that rebellion, becomes a figure of empowerment, someone who represents the idea that we don't have to accept the world as it is. We can seek knowledge. We can challenge the rules. We can create our own path. Of course, this perspective has been buried for centuries. It's no accident that Lucifer is painted as the ultimate villain in mainstream religious texts. If you're in power, the last thing you want is for people to question your authority, right? But the Gnostics, and many other ancient traditions, saw through that. They understood that real power, real freedom, comes from breaking away from control and embracing the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. Let's dive into something even more intriguing, the figure of Jesus. But not the Jesus you might be used to hearing about. In the Gnostic tradition, Jesus wasn't just a savior sent to redeem humanity from sin, he was a messenger sent to reveal the truth about the Demiurge and to help us wake up from the illusion of this world. The Gnostic view of Jesus is incredibly different from what you'd find in traditional Christianity. According to these teachings, Jesus didn't come to reinforce the authority of the God of the Old Testament. In fact, he came to oppose it. He wasn't here to tell people to blindly follow the laws laid down by the Demiurge. Instead, he was offering something much deeper, salvation through knowledge, or gnosis. And this knowledge wasn't about sin or moral rules. It was about realizing that the material world is a prison and that we need to break free from it. So, the Gnostics saw Jesus as more than just a figure of faith. He was a teacher who came to wake people up, to show them that the God most people worship isn't the ultimate source of goodness and light. Jesus was here to say, look beyond the surface. The world you think you know is a trap. In many Gnostic texts, especially the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus isn't portrayed as someone who's focused on performing miracles or preaching about sin and punishment. Instead, he's depicted as a teacher of hidden wisdom. His parables and teachings are cryptic, not because they're supposed to be confusing, but because they're pointing to a deeper reality, one that the Demiurge doesn't want humanity to see. Jesus often spoke about the kingdom of God, but the Gnostics believed this kingdom wasn't some physical paradise we'd reach after death. It was a state of spiritual awakening, something that existed beyond the material world. The Gnostic Jesus didn't care about obedience to religious law. In fact, he often spoke against it. Remember when Jesus was constantly at odds with the Pharisees, the religious leaders of his time? The Gnostics saw this as more than just a disagreement about rules. They believed Jesus was actively rejecting the Demiurge system of control. He wasn't here to make sure people followed religious dogma. He was here to free them from it. This idea comes through even more clearly in the Gnostic texts that didn't make it into the New Testament. Take the Gospel of Judas, for example. In this text, Judas isn't the betrayer we've all been taught to despise. Instead, he's the disciple who truly understands Jesus' message. According to this version of the story, Judas' so-called betrayal wasn't an act of evil, it was part of a plan to help Jesus escape the prison of the material world. Judas was the only one who really got it, who understood that Jesus' mission wasn't about dying for humanity's sins, but about revealing the truth that would set them free from the Demiurge's control. The Gnostics didn't believe that Jesus' death was about paying for humanity's sins. They saw his crucifixion as a way to demonstrate the ultimate truth, that the material world, and even death, are illusions. Jesus' resurrection wasn't just a miracle to prove his divinity. It was a statement, the way of showing that the Demiurge's greatest weapon, death, had no real power over those who had attained true gnosis. For the Gnostics, the real message of Jesus was one of awakening. He wasn't here to save people from their sins through his death on the cross. He was here to save them from ignorance. His teachings were meant to wake people up to the fact that they didn't need to be slaves to the Demiurge's rules, that they could find the divine truth within themselves. And the crucifixion? It wasn't the end of the story, it was just the beginning of realizing that death, like everything else in this world, was part of the illusion. Now, when you think about it like that, the Gnostic interpretation of Jesus changes everything. It's not about following a set of rules or performing rituals to get into heaven. It's about transcending this world, seeing through the veil that the Demiurge has put in front of us, and reconnecting with the true divine source. But this was exactly the kind of thinking that the early church couldn't allow to spread. A Jesus who taught that the God of the Old Testament wasn't the true God. A message that told people to seek enlightenment instead of blind obedience. That's the kind of radical idea that could undermine the entire foundation of institutional religion. And that's why these texts, these alternative gospels, were buried, burned, or labeled as heresy. The Jesus who offered liberation from the Demiurge system wasn't the Jesus the early church wanted people to follow. They needed a figure who reinforced authority, not one who encouraged people to question it. If you've been following along, you've already seen how the Gnostics flipped the script on God, Satan, and even Jesus. But there's one more key player in this cosmic drama, Sophia. She's not a name you hear too often in mainstream religious discussions, but in Gnostic teachings, she's one of the most important figures, maybe the most important. In Gnostic belief, Sophia is a divine figure, often seen as the embodiment of wisdom itself. She's part of the higher spiritual realm, far beyond the material world. But here's where things take a turn. According to Gnostic cosmology, she is actually responsible for the creation of the Demiurge. Yeah, you heard that right. The Demiurge, the being we've been talking about, didn't just come out of nowhere. He was the result of a mistake made by Sophia. Now, don't get this wrong, Sophia wasn't acting out of evil or malice. It's more like an accident, something that happened when she attempted to create something on her own, without the guidance of the higher divine forces. In her desire to bring forth creation, she accidentally birthed the Demiurge. And as soon as she realized what she had done, she knew it was a disaster. The Demiurge, thinking he was the supreme being, went ahead and created the material world, the same one we're all stuck in. Sophia didn't just walk away after this mistake. She didn't abandon the world to the Demiurge's control. In fact, she becomes deeply involved in trying to fix it. That's what makes her such a fascinating figure. Sophia represents both the cause of the problem and the force trying to correct it. In some Gnostic texts, she's depicted as mourning for humanity, feeling deep sorrow over the suffering caused by the world her creation has built. But she doesn't give up. Sophia's story is one of redemption, but not in the traditional sense. She's not here to sacrifice herself or take on the sins of humanity. Instead, her role is about awakening. She works behind the scenes to guide humanity toward gnosis, or true knowledge. It's like she's sending signals, trying to wake us up to the reality that the material world isn't all there is, that we've been trapped in an illusion created by the Demiurge. The Demiurge, being the arrogant, ignorant being that he is, has no idea that Sophia exists above him. He thinks he's the only god, so he has no clue that there's this force of divine wisdom working to undermine his control. Sophia, on the other hand, knows exactly what's going on. She sees the Demiurge for what he is, a flawed creator, ruling over a flawed world. And she's trying to help us break free from his influence. One of the most compelling parts of Sophia's story is the idea that we carry a piece of her within us. The Gnostics believe that every human being has a spark of divine wisdom, a fragment of Sophia, hidden deep within their soul. It's like this tiny, buried treasure that, if discovered, can lead us out of the darkness and back to the true divine source. But the Demiurge has done everything he can to keep that spark hidden. He's built this entire material world, this whole system of control, to keep us distracted so we don't find it. And that's where Sophia's role becomes crucial. She's the one trying to guide us to that hidden spark. In Gnostic texts, she's often seen as a mother figure, nurturing humanity and helping them grow towards spiritual enlightenment. She's not an authoritarian god demanding worship, she's a wise, compassionate force trying to help us wake up. What's really fascinating is how this shifts the whole dynamic of salvation. In the Gnostic view, salvation isn't something that happens because we follow rules or perform certain rituals. It's not even about believing in a specific god or figure. It's about discovering the truth for ourselves. It's about recognizing the divine spark within us and realizing that we're more than just material beings trapped in a material world. And that's what Sophia represents. She's the guide to that truth. She's the one whispering to us, urging us to look beyond the surface, to question everything we've been taught, and to seek the higher reality. In a way, she's the opposite of the Demiurge. While he represents control, ignorance, and deception, Sophia stands for wisdom, freedom, and awakening. In traditional teachings, we're told that the end of the world will bring God's ultimate judgment, a final reckoning where the good are saved and the evil are condemned. But in the Gnostic view, the end of the world isn't about punishment or reward. It's about freedom, the end of the Demiurge's reign, and the beginning of humanity's true awakening. In the Gnostic texts, the so-called apocalypse isn't a terrifying event where the world is destroyed. Instead, it's the collapse of the Demiurge's false reality. It's when humanity finally sees through the illusion of the material world and reconnects with the true divine source. The apocalypse isn't about God's wrath, it's about the liberation of human souls from the control of a flawed creator. You see, the Gnostics believed that once enough people woke up, once enough of us discovered the divine spark within ourselves, the power of the Demiurge would start to crumble. His control over the material world would weaken because the only reason he's been able to rule for so long is through ignorance. The more people understand the truth, the less power he has. And when that happens, when enough of us break free, this world, as we know it, will change forever. The book of Revelation, often seen as the ultimate prophecy of the end times, has been interpreted in countless ways. But from a Gnostic perspective, it's not about the victory of the Demiurge or his final judgment. It's about the fall of the false god. The wars, the chaos, the destruction, they're all symbols of the Demiurge system collapsing under the weight of its own lies. And when the dust settles, it's not about going to some distant heaven. It's about returning to the true divine source, to the realm of pure light and consciousness that exists beyond this material prison. In this view, the Antichrist, often seen as the great enemy in traditional interpretations, could be understood as a force challenging the Demiurge authority. The end times aren't about one final act of obedience to a vengeful God, but about breaking free from a system that has kept humanity trapped for far too long. It's the last battle, not between good and evil, but between knowledge and ignorance. So, what does this mean for us? The Gnostics believe that each of us has the potential to participate in this awakening. We don't have to wait for some distant event or apocalypse to be free. The tools for liberation are already inside us, waiting to be discovered. And as more people wake up to this reality, the power of the material world, the power of the Demiurge, will continue to fade. This idea of a spiritual revolution is incredibly powerful because it suggests that the end times aren't something to fear, they're something to hope for. The end of the world isn't the end of everything. It's the end of illusion. It's the moment when humanity finally breaks free from the cycle of suffering and ignorance and steps into the truth of who we really are. Now, if that doesn't turn everything you've been taught upside down, I don't know what will. The Gnostic apocalypse is about liberation, not destruction. It's about freedom, not judgment. And it's about waking up to the reality that the material world, with all its suffering, is just one tiny part of the bigger picture. When we realize that, when we wake up to the truth, we can start to live differently. We can start to break free from the systems of control that have dominated us for so long. And in the end, that's what the Gnostics were really teaching. The power to wake up is inside each and every one of us. So, as we wrap up this journey through some of the most radical, mind-blowing ideas hidden within ancient texts, I want to thank you for sticking with me all the way to the end. I know we've covered some wild stuff, but I hope it's got you thinking, questioning, and maybe even seeing things from a whole new perspective. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, drop a comment below with your thoughts, and subscribe if you want to dive even deeper into topics like this. God bless, and I'll see you in the next one.